Hey, my name's Wes McDermott, and in this video, we're going to talk about working with 3D and After Effects. We're going to look at working with models, animation, lighting, and we're also going to composite the 3D object into a live scene. So we've got a lot to cover. Let's get into it. For this course, I'm using the latest version of the After Effects beta, which you can download from the Creative Cloud desktop app. To download the project files, you'll find the link in the description of this video, and here I have opened the Beach After Effects project. Now here in the project window, I'm going to have a couple of these 3D model files that I'm going to be working with to get started. If you want to see how the textures for this phone case were created, be sure to check out the Fast Track 3D Texturing for Beginners Substance Painter course. So you can import 3D models just as you would any file here inside of After Effects. So if I just come over and right click, I can choose to import a file. Now, I already have this file imported to my project, so I can just left click, drag and drop, and place this here into the comp in the layer panel, and a window is going to appear that's going to allow me to change the model settings. So here I can set a name for the layer if I like, but the most important setting is this make comp size or object scale. So what I need to do is just click make comp size, and this will adjust the 3D model to fit the size of my comp. And now that this is set up, I'll click OK. And then here in the view, you can see that I have what appears to be a 3D model. And here in the layer panel, I have the 3D model as a layer in my comp. Let's talk about viewport navigation. So if I hold down the Alt or Option key and then use my left mouse button, I can orbit around the 3D model. And now you can see that we do have a 3D model. However, it's really small, so let's zoom in. Again, holding down Alt or Option and using my right mouse button, I can zoom into the view. You can see this little crosshair appears, which will act as the pivot point through which I can orient around the 3D object. Now, if I want to pan, again, I can hold down the Alt or Option, use my middle mouse button, and I can pan around the view. So now let's add a camera. So I can come up here to Layer and choose New, and I'm going to create a camera. Now I'm going to leave everything here at default and then just click OK. And now here you can see that my view has changed, and in my layer stack, I now have my camera. Now, if we take a look here at the bottom of the 3D view, you can see that this drop down for my 3D view pop-up is set to Active Camera. Here at the very top, we have Active Camera, which is going to be Camera 1. So now, if I go in and use the same keyboard shortcuts, I'm now adjusting my camera view as if I'm looking through the camera lens. So let's just frame up a shot. So this now becomes the shot that I'm looking at through this new camera that I've added to my comp. Now I can create multiple views. So let's come over to the viewport drop down here for my view layout. I'm going to choose 2 views. And so this is going to split here into 2 views. And the view that you have selected is going to be outlined by these little blue triangles. And so now if I look at my view drop down or my 3D view pop up, it shows that I'm looking at the top view. Here I can see my camera, I can left click to select it, and I can left click to select my 3D object. Now if we left click over into the first view, you can see that it also is looking at the top view. So let's change this so we can get this nice 2 view to the composition window. So I'll click the drop down, and this time let's go back to that active camera, camera 1. So now I am viewing through the camera lens, my camera 1, and then here on the right side, I have my top view. Now, this is super helpful because you'll often want to make changes to your scene or select objects while being able to view those changes by looking through your main composition camera. Now we're going to talk about positioning a 3D object. Let's add another 3D object to our scene. So here in the project window, I have phone. I'm just going to left click and drag and drop that here to the layer stack and then add it above the hard case. My model settings window appears once again. Let's click make comp size. Now you'll notice in this case, the object scale changes to 400%. So it's twice as big as the hard case. So in my case here, I'm going to go ahead and just change this to 200% so that it matches the hard case. And you can see that it's already rescaled itself. So now that that's set, we'll click OK. And there's my hard case. It's already set and positioned right where it needs to be because everything was at this 0 origin. However, there's a few ways that I can reposition this. So for example, if I zoom in, I have my axis handle or my transform gizmo, and I can just click and drag on a handle and I can move the 3D object around. Here you can see where it can become really useful to have this top view and then seeing the transformation relative to my camera view. I can also move this right here in the camera view as well. So in the case that the phone didn't line up because of the origin, I could just zoom in and manually set the position until the phone looks like it's sitting perfectly inside the case. So I'll just undo that to get the phone right back. I could also use the properties panel. So here you can see that I can come over here to the position and left click and drag the sliders and change the position. I could also change things like the rotation. So if I wanted to change the Y rotation, I could do that here. Also the scale. So we could change the scale manually as well instead of doing that in the model settings. Lots of different options. We could also jump over to the layer stack. I could hit P on the keyboard to open up my position coordinates and then manually drag the input slider here as well. All the typical ways that you would manipulate layers within After Effects are going to work here for the 3D object as well. So now let's set up a parent relationship. I want the hard case to always follow the phone. So I'm going to use my pick whip and then choose the phone. So now if I select the phone and I move it, you'll see that the hard case now follows along. So now let's animate a rotation, and I can grab the X handle axis and I can keyframe this, but as you'll notice here, this is going to be changing the orientation. So what I like to do is I like to just keyframe the actual axis that I want to work with. So here in this case, I'm going to create a keyframe for the X rotation, just move a few seconds here in time, and then adjust my X rotation. So now I have my two keyframes. If we play that back, you can see that we now have this rotation. It's super slow, so let's just move the keyframe back, maybe around 1 second, and let's take a look at this. So again, just a quick preview, and there we go. Simple animation. The case is now following along with the phone as well. Let's double click this X rotation, right click the keyframe, and let's go to our keyframe assistant and choose Easy Ease. So next up, let's add some lights. First thing I'm going to do is just zoom back a little bit here in my camera view. And then I'm going to come up here to Layer and choose New, and we're going to select Light. So I want to make sure that I choose the environment as the light type. And this light is going to work best with your 3D models because it supports image-based lighting and shadows. And you can see here that I have Cast Shadows enabled, and I'm leaving the intensity at 100%. Now, at the recording this video, other lights like the spotlight, it will work with the 3D model, but it just won't cast shadows. So at this point in time, we're just gonna make sure that we have environment selected. Okay, so with that done, we'll click OK, and now you'll see that an environment light has been added here to our scene. So now let's take a closer look at our 3D object from our camera view. So I'm going to set my view here back to a single view, and I'm not really seeing any shadows or much to do with the lighting. And that is going to bring us to a discussion here on the render options. So I'm going to select the render options, and you can see that I have this advanced 3D render options. And it's super important to understand this setting here, which is called casting box size. In After Effects, shadows are computed by a voxel grid based on the casting box. So if we want to see this, I can just simply come over here to this Fit to Scene button. So I'll select it, and you'll see here that this box outlined by these pink lines now appears encompassing around the 3D object. The casting box can now be visualized in the comp window, and it illustrates the size and position of the voxel grid. As I said before, the voxel grid computes the shadows. The resolution and the smoothness will affect the memory usage. And you increase the render quality to get higher quality shadows. Here you can see at a render quality of 1, the shadows are very noisy. And with a higher render quality setting, the shadows are more clean. You'll want to strike a balance between render quality and smoothness to get a clean result and acceptable render times. Another vital point is that objects outside of the casting box will not cast a shadow, but can still receive shadows. So now that we have the light in the scene, let's talk about how we can change the lighting and the lighting direction. Now to do that, we are going to use a high dynamic range image. And from the project folder under HDRI, there is a Beach Final EXR. So double click, take a look. This is the high dynamic range image that we are going to use for our light. So this HDR and the video footage of the beach that we're going to use in this course was created by my friend and coworker, Robert Hiranitsky. So what I'll do is just come over, grab the image, drag and drop it. I'm just going to place it here at the bottom of my layer stack. So now I can select the light, and then here in the properties panel, you'll see that we have our source. Let's click this drop down, and I'm going to choose Beach Final EXR, and that is going to now use this new HDR to light my scene. And you can see that the lighting has dramatically changed. To change the lighting direction, I can come over here to my layer transform under the Y rotation and just adjust the angle. And you can see just by changing this slider, I can change the direction of the light. So now I'm going to add a shadow catcher. So we'll go to layer and I'm going to choose new solid and I'm going to name this shadow catcher. And I'll leave the width and height at 1920 1080 and the color doesn't really matter for this, and we'll click OK. So this creates a new solid here in my scene, and first thing I want to do is turn this into a 3D layer. So I'm just going to tick this 3D layer box, and now I have this 3D solid that's going to act like a plane, and you can see that it's already starting to accept some of the shadows. All right, let's jump into a 2 view, and let's go to my left view, and I'm just going to rotate this solid. So I'll hold down Shift and left click till I get this to be at 90 degrees. We'll zoom in a little bit here. And I'm just going to move this solid down slightly. And now you can see that, well, we get a little bit of shadow here onto this plane. So let's check the rotation of the phone. So I'm just going to move my slider, and you can see, well, we definitely don't want this. The phone is intersecting with the plane. So now I'm just going to move this down until I get something that looks like that. Okay, perfect. This is my little setup. We'll go back to 0, 0. And now I have this little shadow plane here. So I'm going to drop this back to my single view, and for this shadow catcher, what I really want is just to have the shadow itself. And we can do that by just coming over here to the actual layer, and let's take a look at these material options. So here in these material options, you can see that there is a section here for accept shadows, and it's set to on. Well, if I click this little switch, you can see that this will switch to only, and it appears that our shadow is gone. But what's happening for this layer is that we're only seeing the shadow, and this black background is the color of our composition. So for example, if I come over here to composition and we go to our composition settings and I change the background color, we can then have this cool effect where the shadow is just casting on any background. In this case, it's a solid color, but it could also just be a video as well. So now as I move my camera and just kind of rotate around the scene, you can see that I get this infinite environment, which is super helpful, especially for things like product renderings. Now, you can also come here and change the shadow color. So I have a swatch, or I can even color pick. So in my case here, what I'm going to do is just click the color swatch button, and I'm just going to give these shadows a slight kind of bluish tint. So let's try something like this. I don't know, we'll make it really subtle, but you can see that we can go in and we can tint these shadows. Now, I think that's a little bit too intense, so I'll probably just give it a little bit of a darker value. There we go. But again, you can tint these shadows by using the shadow color parameter. Let's talk about the 3D bin. So here in the timeline, if you take a look, here you can see that we have this 3D layer icon. And we have several 3D layers, and surrounding these 3D layers, you can see that we have this little box. And this is what's referred to as the 3D bin. These bins allow you to composite multiple 3D renders into the same composition and have them share cameras and lights. For example, I have this text layer. Now, if I were to drag this 2D layer in between any of my 3D layers, you'll notice that the bin is broken. So let's take a look at the icons. You can see here that we have this 2D text layer, and now the bin has been divided into 2 separate 3D bins, which means we have 2 separate 3D renders happening within this composition. And what's happening here is the phone is in a bin separate of the shadow catcher ground. Layers in different bins, they do not intersect or cast shadows upon each other. So in this case, I'm no longer getting the shadow casted from the phone onto my shadow catcher ground. Now, if I wanted to fix this, I could take the shadow catcher and then just make sure I drag it below the 2D layer, and now my shadow comes back. Again, if we take a look, you can see that we have our shadow catcher, our phone, and our hard case are now all being rendered inside the same 3D bin, correctly rendering my scene. So now we're going to take a look at how we can apply effect to a 3D model. Now, you can't apply an effect directly to the 3D model. So for example, I have a hue saturation. If I want to try to apply this, you can see, can't actually do it. So there's quite a few different ways that you can go about this. So in this particular case, what I can do here is I'm going to come over to my layer stack, and I'm going to start just by creating a new solid, and we'll call this effects. So we'll just name this effects, just leave it, color doesn't matter in this case. So now I have a 2D layer. And here in my effects controls, what I'm going to do is, there's a couple different ways we could do it. First off, if I come over here to, let's say I could grab a calculations, we'll say. So we could grab calculations. We can come over here to the second source. We're going to pick the hard case, and I'm going to set this layer opacity for this second layer all the way up to 100. Now I'm starting to see the case itself, and for the blending mode, we'll set it to copy. So now you can see that I'm able to take the 3D layer, which is the phone animated, this hard case animated GLB, the 3D layer, and I can essentially kind of pull that into a 2D layer, as you can see here. Now, we got a couple problems with this particular workflow in this case because, well, the phone's now disappeared, but we'll get to that in a moment. But for now, at this point, we have a 2D representation of our 3D content, which means we can now apply effects. So again, I'll grab my hue saturation, we'll throw this into here, and if I start to adjust to say my hue, now we've got a really great way to change some effects here like this hue. But what's really cool about this is if I were to go and grab the 3D layer and I start to move it, check this out, we can now move it. Now again, you'll see that we have to deal with the actual phone itself. We'll do that in a second. But any changes that we make here to the 3D layer, you can see the 2D layer is going to update for us. So that's one method we could use. Now, instead of calculations, let's turn this off and let me show you another way we could do this. We could also use CC Composite, which is actually a little bit easier. So we'll drag in CC Composite. And for the top layer, once again, I'll choose that hard case. And then here I can uncheck RGB only, and I can start to play around with how I want this to blend. So this is going to be in front. I can change this to copy. And again, you get the same result. But the difference being that I can now maybe duplicate this. So if I duplicate CC Composite, and you could also do this with calculations, just CC Composite's a little easier. Here I'll grab the phone for the top layer. So now I have my phone back, but it's not intersecting. I could try playing around with some of these blending modes, like maybe this needs to be in front, or is it behind? Let's see here, where is that? Is it behind? You know, so on and so forth. That's definitely not going to work. But if I choose this to be Silhouette Alpha, you can see that it is going to fit into here. So now I have this phone in place and it's working. However, I have another problem. If I were to enable my hue and saturation, oh, look at this. It's sort of working, but not really. We're getting like this second version of this. Okay, so this isn't going to work in this case because I have a very particular situation where I have one 3D model is intersecting with another. So here's how I would work around this little problem. So instead of calling this effects, let's just go ahead and call it phone 2D. This is going to be our 2D representation of our 3D objects. Now what I'll do is I'm going to grab a layer, and this time I'm going to make a new adjustment layer. And for this adjustment layer, let's grab a hue and saturation, and we'll throw this in. So now I'm going to jump back to my phone 2D layer where I have my CC Composite, and I need to make a change here to this transfer mode. So what I want to do for the second layer, which again, this represents my phone, I'm going to click this drop down, and I'm going to choose in front. So this is what I end up getting here, okay? And it looks like it's all overlapping, but that's fine because this layer we're going to use as a track mat. So what I'm going to do is go back to my adjustment layer, and I'll just use my pick whip, and let's pick the phone 2D layer. So now, once we have that set up, you can see that my intersection now looks like it's rendering correctly. And if I jump over to the adjustment layer and I play around with this master hue, I now get the control that I wanted. Now, setting this up as a matte also means that I can apply effects to the matte as well. So like if I needed to blur or choke the resulting alpha, I could do so. Again, more flexibility. And so that's how we can add effects to our 3D models. And in this case, like I said, I had to use my track mat here just because I have these three objects that are intersecting, like this phone inside the case. It's a little bit more of a complex example, but now you see how you can work around that. Okay, so one more thing to show. In this particular scene setup, I really don't need to use this 2D phone layer. Watch this. I can delete it. The adjustment layer is going to work. And that is because of the way that I'm setting up my scene using just this shadow catcher. So I'm just using the shadow catcher, and it is being applied to the color backdrop being just the composition settings color backdrop. So this effect doesn't have any control over that. So in a setup as simple as this, which is actually kind of a practical setup, like I said, for product renders and stuff, you don't need to go through all of those steps. I did want to show you that because you will need it very often for other projects, but in something simple like this, an adjustment layer will get you exactly what you need. Okay, so here I have the asset, just a really simple animation. You can see I'm looking at my speed graph here, tweak some of the keyframes, change some of the colors. So just some really basic things here in After Effects. And what we want to talk about now is how we can leverage keyframed animation here within After Effects alongside any embedded animations that are available within 3D models that we might be working with. So before we jump straight into that embedded animation, another thing I wanted to showcase here is this draft 3D mode. So you can see it here at the bottom of the UI. And once you start kind of building up your animations, this is a great mode. So if you enable it, you can see that what it does essentially is it turns off the shadows. It also turns off any of the effects, those 2D layers that we set up with the adjustment layer. All that stuff's gone. So now you'll see I'll go through the timeline, add a few keyframes just to further finesse the animation, and then I jump into the speed graph and just adjust the curves, all while I have Draft 3D enabled, again, so that I can see my animation very quickly as I work. So now we want to work with the embedded animation that's in the animated hard case. And so if I come over here and open up the properties, you'll see that I have this animation options, and there's a drop down here. So if I click this drop down, and here we'll scroll down, you can see that there's some animation that's embedded in this. And so I'm going to select this animation track, and if we take a look, it looks like the case disappeared. That's just because of my time slider. You can see this animation layer has now set its duration to be the length of the animation, which is around 2 seconds here. So if I scrub my time slider back and I hit play, we now have this embedded animation playing here within After Effects. And the thing that I really think is awesome about this is the case is using a skinned deformation. And so that's a really great use case for having these embedded animations. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, one of the great things is that we can actually use time remapping here. So with this layer selected, I'm going to come up here to my layer and choose time, and I'm going to enable time remapping. So now I can start to work with these keyframes. So the first thing I want to do is I would like to have the animation start with the case close. And if I just scrub my timeline, I can see that here at 1 second, the case is closed. So let's do this. Let's go back to this first keyframe, and I'll type in 30 and hit enter, and that puts it right at 1 second. So we're starting the animation off at 1 second. Now, as I play, it's going to continue to play that embedded animation until it gets to the end, which is at this keyframe here. Now, because I'm using time remapping, I can now extend the layer. So let's take a look at what we have so far. I'll hit play. Again, it plays really fast because I'm in Draft 3D mode, and here's what we have. Okay, so let's start playing around with this more now that we have our keyframes in place. So what I'd like to do is as the phone starts, it opens up. It's opening pretty slow, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to take this second keyframe and move it towards the left, and you can see that that's just, again, I'm time remapping the animation data that is inside the 3D layer. So we're not just interpolating frames here. After Effects is actually retiming the animation data. So that means I can do something really cool. Like here's a quick example. If I pull the keyframe all the way here to the right and we play, look, I can get this crazy smooth slow motion effect here. So look at this, really nice and smooth. It's not interpolating the frame, but I don't want that. I want it to be quicker. So we'll move the keyframe to the left. Now hit play. The case opens up pretty quick. All right, I think that's gonna work. So now what I'd like to do is have it just kind of stay open for a few moments. So we'll copy this second keyframe and paste it in. And I'd like the case to kind of move back as it starts to tilt in my hand keyframes that I put inside of After Effects. So as it starts to move back, here at the end, I'd like to have the keyframes, or I'd like to have the case just close again. So what I'll do is just come back here for this final keyframe. Let's set it back to 30 and hit enter. That gives me another keyframe. So now let's play everything and see what we get. Case opens, and there it closes. Now again, it's too slow on the close, no problem. We can just easily adjust my keyframes. So again, just kind of making a few little adjustments here. And let's check the timing on this. Just scrub the timeline, hit play. And I still think it's a little slow, so let's do this. Just kind of play around with these keyframes again. Opens up, and case closed. All right, looks pretty good. So now, if I wanted to, I could then come in, select all the keyframes, right-click, and I could just quickly add some easing on this. So let's just add our easy ease. Let's see what that does. See, it opens up. Yeah, looks pretty good. Gives it a little bit more snappiness, a little bit more, makes the, the animation look a little bit more alive, I think. And so here, what you're seeing is that we have this combination of working with embedded animation data within the 3D model that I can retime here in After Effects, plotting down some time remapping keyframes, which is pretty cool. And that is being added on top of just some hand animation that I was doing here on the first layer. So let's select this layer as well and hit the U key on the keyboard. So again, you can see the mixture of the time remap keyframe for the animation data and then that rotation keyframe on top. So that's how we can work with animation data that's embedded inside the 3D model here directly inside of After Effects. Okay, so to start off, I'm in this second comp that I call track, and I have this beach final HD full MOV, and so you can see it's just this little beach shot here. This is what this looks like. And I've run the 3D camera tracker. So on the effects control, you can see I have 3D camera tracker, and there's all my track points. So the next thing I did was I just duplicated this, right? So we're gonna do everything fresh in this project. So if we come over, let's take a look here at our effects, the 3D camera tracker. Again, here's my tracking data. Now, if I mouse over in this area, you can see that I have this little target. And I'm just going to lasso select a few of these points. And this is where I want to set my origin point. And this actually looks pretty good where it is. So I'm just going to right click and I'm going to choose to set my ground plane in origin. And from this point, I'm also going to right click again and choose to create a null and a camera. So when I do that, we get a track null, which is going to be right here in the center, and then we have our 3D camera tracker. It's what it's called. If we look at our active camera, it is set to the 3D tracker camera. Now, if I just kind of play here, let's select that track null, and I just kind of scrub my timeline, you can see that we have this null that's now locked in here to the scene. So that's the track point, and we can apply or add our 3D objects to the scene and parent them to this null. So let's start taking a look at that process. So now I need to add my 3D objects. Let's come over to 3D. I'm going to grab the phone, left click. I'm just going to drag and drop, and just for organizational sake, I'm throwing it below the camera, and you can see it's very small. It's way off out of frame. Now, what I'll do is I'll use the pick whip, and I'm just going to parent it to the track null. So first step. Now, with the phone selected, I'll hit the P key for position, and I have some coordinates. I'm just going to zero this out. So 0, 0, 0 on the XYZ, and that is just going to quickly place the phone right on that track point. It's super tiny, but we'll fix that in a moment. Now, so we can see what we're doing, let's drop over to a second view, and I can zoom in, and as I said, here is that phone. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is the phone has the transform gizmo. It's right here in the center. This is the origin point or the pivot point. The pivot point can be assigned in your 3D program. Now, in this case for the phone, I didn't do it. I was lazy. I left it right in the center, which, depending on your project, in the center, if I'm trying to kind of flip and rotate it around, that's great. But in this particular case, I want to rotate, and I want to rotate from the bottom, like the phone's going to be sitting here on this rock. So I want to adjust the pivot. Now, I could go back to my 3D program and do all that, but instead, I can just adjust the anchor point here inside of After Effects. So here I have my X, Y, and Z in the properties. If I adjust the Z axis, and it's, if I type in, let's just do -40, it's pretty close to what I want there. So now I've set that anchor point. Okay, that's in position. Let's add the hard case now. So I'm going to select the hard case. I'm going to drag it in just below the phone, and I'm going to use the pick whip. Let's parent it to the track null. Hit P to open up my position. Zero everything out once again, 0, 0, 0, and there's the phone case. Now, it also has the pivot right in the center. We know how to fix that. Anchor point on the z-axis. Let's type in -40 once again, and now that is set in place. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here, and what I want to do is just readjust this case. Now you can see that it's getting kind of cut off here. No problem. What I usually do in this case is I'll just enter draft mode. Now I can see everything. And all I want to do with the hard case selected is I'm just going to grab here the x-axis and just move it over. I'm just aligning the case so that it covers the phone. So that should look pretty good. Of course, I can always check my other views. If we pop into the left view and we just kind of zoom in on this guy, we can just make sure that everything's lining up. For example, the phone buttons, are they showing up where the case is? It looks like it's okay. If there's any problems, it's easy enough to fix. But so far, this is looking pretty decent. Okay, so now what I want to do is make sure that the hard case is parented to the phone. So right now, it's parented to the track null. So I'm going to use the pick whip, parent it to the phone. So if I select my phone and I move, let's say in the x-axis, now the case comes along for the ride. Perfect. Now, it still looks super small here in the scene. We are going to scale things up, but before we do that, I want to take advantage of this position the phone is in right now. It's laying down, it's on the 000, and it's going to allow me to do some work here for the screen. So up until this point, we've been working with this phone screen, and it's just off. It's just blank screen, and that's boring. We want to add some graphics here to the screen. So let's look at how we can do a screen replacement here in After Effects. So I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to come over to my timeline, and I'm going to disable here the hard case. I'm going to start by going to Layer and choosing a new solid, and we'll just call this Screen for now. And we have our width and height, and this solid is going to have a specific aspect ratio that's going to match the aspect ratio of what the phone screen is. Now, I've kind of worked out the width and height ahead of time, so I want this to be 380 by 840. And what I'm most concerned with is this frame aspect ratio at 0.45. Okay, so that's going to work. Let's just give this a really bright value so you can see it, and we'll click OK. And now I have the solid here. Now, we want to make this a 3D layer, so we're going to come over here, and I'm just going to tick the 3D object, and now we can see we have our screen, again, super, super tiny. However, we are going to parent it to the phone, and same trick, we'll hit P on the keyboard to go to our position, and let's type in 0, 0, 0. And now we have the screen in position, but we just need to rotate it. So if I jump over here to, say, like my left view, this is what we want to work with here. So I can just grab this X handle, left click and drag. I'm going to hold down Shift and it'll snap. And I'm just going to snap it to 90 degrees. And while I'm here in my left view, I'm just going to move this up on the Z axis. What would be super helpful is if I just left click on this other view, and let's just change the view really quickly to my top view. So now we can see our top view. We'll go back to the screen. Let's zoom in, and I'm going to push up on the Z-axis until the screen just fits right inside the phone, like that. Okay, let's jump this over here to our top view. I'm going to zoom out, and I can see that my screen overall is still pretty big, right? Because, again, the phone is smaller than what this screen is. So no problem. What I'm going to do here is just adjust the scale manually. I'll come in and just drag the scale until this just kind of matches up. Let's zoom in on it, take a look. And now it's just a matter of going through this little process here just to fit the screen so that it actually covers the 3D model phone screen. And this is looking pretty good. Let's see, for my scale, let's do, you know what, let's just do 20. Let's go back down to 19%. That should do fine. Okay, so now the big thing here is I just want to make sure, again, if I zoom in, I just wanted to make sure, I hit the space bar. I just wanted to make sure that the screen was fitting into the phone just under this beveled edge of the phone itself, the actual body of the phone. Okay, so now we have this set. It's working, it's parented, but we do have this masking issue. And now I'll just come into the solid itself. I'm going to grab here the pen tool, and I'm just going to quickly create a mask. So here I'm just using the pen tool, creating a mask, adjusting the Bezier handles, just being careful that the edge is lining right up with the beveled edge of the phone, and that'll take care of the mask. So now that we have our screen and mask in place, with the screen selected, I'm going to go to Layer, and I'm going to pre-compose this layer, and we'll call this Screen Replacement. And we're going to leave all the attributes in the new comp. And so now I have a new composition. It's already parented to the phone. And if I double click, I can jump into this comp that's going to be set up with the aspect ratio that I need to match my screen replacement. So here in the footage, I have a graphic that was created by Robert, and it's a PSD file. If I drag and drop and place that here into my layer, and I'll just scale it down, so we get something like that. And now I have this UI that I'm gonna use here for the screen. I could add an image, I could add video, but in my case here, we'll just go with this image. Kind of a funny note, this content that I'm showing in this course was actually created by a session that Robert and I did at the Adobe Max Keynote in 2024. So that's why you see Max Keynote, Wes and Rob here. It's kind of funny. Okay, so there we have the UI. I have this red screen back here. So with this selected, I'm gonna go to my solid settings. And now I'm gonna go ahead and turn this to black. And this will be nice, kind of a black edge of the LCD. That's what that's gonna represent. So I'm going to use that as well. Now, I'll hit save. Before we jump over to the next comp, I wanna show you something else that's pretty cool, is if I come over here to Window and I go to Essential Graphics, I can take this screen and just drag and drop and place it here into the panel. We'll call this, we'll just call it Screen. And what this is going to do is allow me to quickly change the screen graphic without having to jump in and out of comps. Here, I'll show you what I mean when we get over to the new comp. So we'll save this. We'll jump back to our original comp. And here you can see we have our screen replacement. If I select the screen replacement in the Properties panel under Essential Properties, look, I have this little input here. And if I had another image, I could simply drag and drop and just add it in here. Here's a cool option. If I grab that beach final MOV and place it into here, look, I can have video in my screen replacement as well. Pretty cool. Now, we have a problem. The screen's upside down and it's flipped. So we need to fix this. A really quick way to fix it while I'm here is let's just rotate the comp. So on the Z rotation, I'm going to set this to 180. So that is going to rotate it so that it flips in the vertical, but now the horizontal is backwards. Another quick way to fix that, if we come over to the scale, and I'm going to unlink it, and then we have our X, Y, and Z. Let's take the X and just set it to -19. So it was 19 before, and I just set it to negative, and that just flipped it. So that's just a quick way to set that up. All right, I don't need the Essential Graphics panel. We can close that. Let's go to a single view. And let's look at this, not in Draft 3D, but we're going to be looking at it from my active camera, which I am. I have my phone, and it is parented to the right 3D object. Good. All right, so I have my phone. Let's go ahead and scale this guy up now. So we'll just scale using the Property panel. So I'll just do a quick little scale. Let's rotate this into place. And again, scale it up. Okay, now we don't see the hard case, but remember I just had it turned off. So we'll just enable the hard case. And now here we have our screen replacement. We have the phone and the hard case. And if I start to scrub through the timeline, it's now sitting tracked into my footage because the phone is parented to that null. Now, one last thing we need to do for our screen. Let's select the screen comp, and if I take a look at the properties underneath material options, you'll see here that we have these options for cast, accept shadows, and accept lights. For this screen, I want to take the accept lights, and I want to switch this to off. So that is what we want to do for having this work like it's an actual lit panel, like an LCD or something like that. And speaking of this being like a panel, what we could do is just jump back into screen replacement and just duplicate this layer and change the blending mode to screen. And so now if we jump back, you can see that that just kind of helps make it look like the screen is actually on. Now we're going to adjust the lighting. So what we'll do is we'll go to Layer, choose New, and we're going to create a new light. Make sure that we have environment type. We'll leave intensity at 100 and cast shadows is enabled. Click OK. And so here we have our light. Let's come over to our properties panel. Now I do have this beach final EXR is already here in my scene. Again, this is what it looks like. Got the EXR. Let's just drag it towards the bottom. Go back to the light, and in the properties panel for source, select beach final EXR. And so now we're starting to get some light. Here we don't see our shadows really though, and so here's where we need to set that casting box size. Now, in this case, we actually have this background. So what I'd like to do in this case is just make sure that the elements that I want to cast shadows, I want those to be visible before I set the casting box size. So what I'll do is just come over here to phone. Let's solo this, and we'll solo the hard case. Let's come to advanced settings, render options, and I'm going to fit the casting box to scene. So now it's just encompassing our 3D objects. We'll click OK, and then turn off here that solo. And now we can start to play around with the light rotation. Actually, before we do that, we need to set up our shadowcaster so that we're casting shadows on this background video plate. So just as we did previously, we're going to go to Layer, New, Solid, and we'll just call this shadowcatcher. And the color doesn't really matter, but I like to just kind of keep it this kind of default mid-gray. Comp size is fine. We'll click OK. And as you recall, we're going to turn this into a 3D layer. And just for organizational sake, I'm just going to drag this down so it's kind of below the phone. It's fine in this case. Again, it's all part of the 3D bin. Now, what I'm going to do is take this shadow catcher, because I do need it to be tracked with our track null, or I need it to be aligned with that. So we're going to use our pick whip to parent to the track null, hit the P key on the keyboard to go to position. Let's clear this out, 0, 0, 0 on the XYZ. And then I'll grab my X axis handle and I'll hold down Shift, and I'm just going to snap rotate this to 90 degrees. There we go. And so now you can start to see that I do have my shadows casting. The plane is really small, but no problem. Now that we have it in our scene, we can just click these little handles here to scale this up. And so I just want this to kind of encompass the area that I'm going to be working with here. And just as we did previously, we are going to go to our material options. So we'll go to material options, and we are going to tell accept shadows to only. And so now we have our shadow cast in the scene. Now, since we actually do have a background plate, what we can do is use the color sample, and let's just try to sample a value, like a shadow, a dark shadow value here in the actual backplate. So I'm going to choose maybe something like this. And you can see where that, adjusts the overall kind of value of our shadow, and that looks pretty good for now. Okay, so we have that in place. We can keep tweaking with that, but just for now, I just need to have some type of shadow so that I could kind of ground this phone or this 3D object here into my scene. Again, it's really large. It's not really in perspective, but it's, it's kind of part of this little fake ad that I'm putting together. Now we can look at setting up the correct light direction. And to do that, I've added another 3D object here, this chrome sphere. So let's just enable that here in my scene. And I'm going to, I'll leave the phone on so we can see the shadows. So this chrome sphere is metallic, completely reflective. And what this is doing is it's allowing me to see that HDR background image. And I can see how my environment is, being reflected here in this sphere. And I can actually see the directional, or the sun itself, which is really cool. So if I go to my environment light, what I'll do is start looking for like cues in the background plate. So you'll look through and just see like if I can tell where shadows are being casted, like how long they are, that kind of stuff. And then I can also just come over here to my rotation. And as I start to change the rotation, you'll see not only do the shadows move, but I could see how the sun position is in relation to the scene because of my chrome sphere. And this really helps in setting up a very accurate direction for the lighting here. So again, just looking at some visual cues to see what I can come up with. We'll do something like that. I could even play around with the X rotation as well, if I wanted to kind of, make these shadows not as long. So maybe I'll just kind of play with this too. Maybe something a little bit more like, let's say like this. And yeah, there we go. Looks pretty good. Okay, so now that this is in place, I can just take the visibility option for this chrome layer. I'll just turn that off. And now I have the phone, and my shadow light direction is set up. So here's the scene with everything tracked. I'm in draft 3D mode, and we now just want to work with the animation on the phone cover. So what we'll do is come over here to the hard case animated layer, and let's take a look at those animation options, and we're going to set that to enable that animation track. And so now, just as we covered earlier, we are going to go to layer, and we're going to go to time and enable time remapping. Now, what I'd like to do is have it to where it starts with the cover closed, and so I can see that's right at 1 second. So we'll go back to our first keyframe here, and I'll just type in 30, and that is going to close the cover. So now, as we scrub through the timeline, you can see that as the camera moves, the case opens, and now we just need to take the layer and just extend it here towards the end. So scrubbing a little further, I'd like to have it to where then the case folds back to close. So let's create another little hold keyframe here, and then we'll scroll back towards the end, and what we'll do is set this back to 30, so that'll close. So now let's take a look at this animation. So we'll go through, you can see that the case opens, flips around, and then it closes back. So now let's finish off this scene by adding a depth of field effect. So what I'm going to do is take our beach comp, and I'm just going to nest that into a new comp. And I'm going to come over here to my effects and presets, and under 3D channel, there's an option here for 3D channel extract. So we'll apply this 3D channel extract. And what this will do, you can see it here if I start to adjust this black point, is that it will actually create depth information from the 3D data in the scene. And so this is super powerful and really great to create a depth mask for various lens blur effects. So what I'll do is, just set a value. The other thing I like to do in this case is I'm just going to grab a levels here, and let's apply the levels. And I'm just going to make a quick adjustment here to the levels to create here basically a depth map that is focusing on the phone. Now, my shadow is super noisy. Again, I haven't increased the quality of my shadows at this time, so we'll worry about that on the very last step. Okay, so next thing I want to do in this case is take care of the background. Now, the only 3D object I have in my scene was the shadow catcher and the phone, so I need to kind of fake a background in this case, and what I'll do is just come over and create a solid, and I'm just going to call this background, and let's look in our effects and presets for a gradient ramp, and we're going to apply this. And now I'm just going to play around with these values a little bit here. So let's grab something like this, and we're going to set the blending mode here to add. So now it's just a matter of adjusting these values a little bit. So let's get something maybe close to here. Let's actually do this. And like I said, just a couple little quick adjustments. I think this is going to work. There we go. All right, so very quick and dirty, we have a depth matte. So with these two layers selected, I'm just going to pre-compose these two guys, and we're going to call this depth. And we're going to move all the attributes into a new composition, and we'll click OK. All right, so here we have our depth. Let's go back to our project, and I'm going to take here my beach and bring this into the top layer. Okay, so with the beach layer selected, let's come over and grab a camera lens blur effect and apply that. Now, for the blur map, we want to choose that new depth pass that we just created. And I'll just increase this blur radius just a little bit, so we'll get something like that. You can see how the depth effect is now starting to work, and we can just now play around with the focal distance. So we'll just make a quick adjustment here to where we have our background blurred and that foreground, which is going to be that foreground rock element, and our phone pretty much in focus. It's a little intense right now, so let's just back off that blur radius. Again, just a little bit of a subtle effect is all we're looking for. And there we go, quick depth of field effect using the 3D channel extract to pull that depth information from our 3D data. Here's a final render. I've added some simple text and some color grading. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and learned a lot. There's so much you can do with 3D and After Effects, and the feature is constantly improving. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.